This is Virtual Environmental Education. This is Rising Sea Levels. This is our 7th lesson already. I'm Anna. I am the co-president of Sustainability Club.
I'm Joseph. I'm the other co-president of Sustainability Club.
I'm Katya. I'm the vice president of Sustainability Club.
And I am Laila, and I am one of the members of Sustainability Club.
So the definition of sea level. Sea level is the base level for measuring elevation and the depth on Earth. Because the ocean is one continuous body of water, its surface tends to seek the same level throughout the world. However, winds, currents, river discharges, and variations in gravity and temperature prevent the sea surface from being truly level. Let's find out more about this.
What are rising sea levels? The global sea level has been on the rise since the early 20th century or the beginning of the 1900s. Sea levels currently rise at a rate of about 1/8 of an inch every year. Sea levels are mostly a result of melting glaciers, or sea level rises, are mostly a result of melting glaciers and ice sheets and the thermal expansion of water due to global warming. So this basically means that glaciers are melting because temperature is getting warmer. So take, for example, Antarctica. We're seeing lots of news about Antarctica, about ice sheets melting. And that's because as the temperatures get higher, the molecules of water expand, and that causes water to melt. And then also thermal expansion of water just basically means that as, like I just said, as temperatures get higher, water molecules move further apart. So that's basically when you boil water, for example, when you're making pasta, water, when it boils, it's heated up to the point that it becomes a gas, and this would be similar. It's just like ice melting into water. So since 1993, the global sea level has increased by about 3.2 inches. The rate of sea level rise today is 2.5 times the rate of what it had been during the majority of the 20th century. But that's kind of scary to think about because 2.5 is a lot. And it also means that this is a much more serious problem that we need to address today than we did need to address back then. So we definitely need to take some action. And sea levels are measured by using tide stations. So those measure signal links to the ocean floor, and then also satellites from space, satellite laser altimeters, and these use radio waves to measure levels. And then let's take a look at this picture. This is not real, this is just a depiction, but basically this is a possibility of what could happen. This is New York City, and this wouldn't be for a few hundred years, but if current rates of greenhouse gases are released at the same rate that they are today, this would definitely be possible because global warming would result in the melting of almost pretty much all ice caps and glaciers on Earth, and that's around, I think, 2.3%, but I'm not 100% sure. We'll touch on that later. But it's a huge chunk of all water on Earth, and that would just result in a few hundred feet of rising sea levels, which would completely cover coastal cities and displace millions, if not billions of people. So that would definitely be a major problem. And we would also have to abandon those cities. We'd lose cities such as New York, and those are important cities to our world globally. So we would have a lot of problems if the current rate of greenhouse gases were released continuously.
So how have sea levels on Earth changed over time? During Earth's last glacial period, the global sea level was more than 400 feet lower than it is currently. This was only around 27,000 years ago, and was due to the fact that over 10 million square miles of ice covered the planet. Now, these ice sheets covered most of North America and different ones also covered South America. Additionally, due to these low sea levels, the Bering Strait allowed people to migrate across continents. However, later it was submerged with rising sea levels due to melting glaciers and ice. This continues today, where we see melting ice sheets, particularly in Antarctica, due to the warming temperatures as a result of climate change.
More historical changes to sea levels. Sea levels have risen over the past 20,000 years from being 400 feet below the current level due to natural climate change. It grew at an extremely fast rate until 7,000 years ago, when the climate stabilized and caused the level to stabilize as well. This means that sea levels were consistent back then, but now that they have really increased nowadays. To continue, in the 1850s, with the beginning of mass industrialization, it contributed to a rise in CO2 levels in our atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and a greenhouse gas traps heat. Greenhouse gases leads to accelerated rate of global warming, and also leads to thermal expansion of water. Meaning, like Anna said in the beginning, when it gets warm, water molecules begin to expand and separate, and that warm temperature causes to rise. And when they do rise, the global warming has the power to melt those ice sheets and glaciers. And again, once these sea levels rise, where's the water going to go? The water needs to be placed somewhere, and that usually is placed on the shores or in cities. If we move on to the next slide, this is a chart of the end of the glacial period and into the industrialization period. And as you can see, it shows how extremely fast sea levels have risen. Right in the beginning, right in the middle, my bad. It just shows that like really big increase. And to me, that does not look good, and it shouldn't look good. So, yeah.
What are the causes of sea level rise? Well, there are two major causes of rising sea levels, and both have to do with the rising temperatures of the Earth, and that is because of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The two major causes are thermal expansion and ice melting. So thermal expansion happens when the sea levels, when the water in the sea increases in temperature, and therefore it expands because the molecules grow a little farther apart. Melting ice, such as the ice sheets and glaciers, melt due to the rising global temperatures, and the ice sheets and glaciers are both large formations of ice that store about 2.3% of the water on the planet. And around 2.3% of the water on the planet, for context here, is about 7.5 million trillions of water. And I know that number sounds made up, but it's real if you Google it, and it's that's just such a large number that like I can't even wrap my mind around. And so just to know that that much water is being stored, but now since the temperatures are rising, that is being released in the ocean, doesn't sound good. And the melting ice, so these melting ice caps result in a greater acceleration of the rising sea levels, and this is all because of the process of global warming.
Sea levels rise in different areas at different rates due to many different factors, such as subsidence, which is the sudden shrinking or the downward decline of ground surface. Upstream flood control, this is relocating water to flow different ways, which can cause the ocean to have a lower surface at some places, whereas it has a higher surface at other places. Regional ocean currents, so ocean currents relocate water to different areas, and then variations in land height. The height of the land at different points in the ocean can displace the water so that certain areas are higher and other areas are lower. And then if we look at this picture, it just explains them in the picture context. So we could see water or water that's stored in ice caps and glaciers. As they melt, that water gets displaced. As water warms, as the ocean warms, the water expands. So those water molecules are moving further apart from each other. And so there's not technically more water. It's more that as the water is expanding, it needs somewhere else to go in order to sustain the expansion. Surface and deep ocean circulation changes, which causes storm surges. This can lead to flooding and subsidence in river delta regions, land movements, and tectonic displacements. So a tectonic displacement may be a tsunami. I don't know if you guys have ever heard about tsunamis, but they result in a large amount of water displacement. They can cause a lot of flooding, and even though it's not permanent flooding, it still displaces a lot of water. And then lastly, terrestrial water storage. So this could be terrestrial just means on Earth. This can be extraction of groundwater or water that's stored underground, building of reservoirs, changes in runoff, and seepage into aquifers. And for example, let's say you stored a lot of water in a reservoir and you decide to drain all that water. Well, all that water needs to go somewhere. So let's say you empty it into the ocean. That could lead to a minor, because it's not that much, sea level change.
Projections for sea level rise. The Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change expects that by the end of 2100, sea levels are going to rise between 10 and 30 inches due to temperature changes of 1.5 degrees Celsius. This can cause major problems threatening infrastructure like roads, bridges, and power plants, as well as contributing to more dangerous natural disasters like flooding and hurricanes. A recent example of this included the South Asia floods, which forced 12 million people to flee from their homes. And this will continue if sea levels continue to rise, with possibly millions of people being displaced as their homes are no longer habitable.
More projections for sea level rise. If all the ice on Earth melted, the global sea level would raise by 216 feet. Imagine that, 216. That's taller than our homes, our communities, our friends' homes, even some schools. All of this would get flooded and people would be displaced and our economy would decrease statistically. If this happens, this could also result in our regions located at sea level to be completely gone. Again, a lot of displacement, unnecessary things. For example, the state of Florida and coastal cities such as New York or Singapore, and many islands, countries such as the Maldives, among others, are expected to be completely flooded. And lastly, this situation would only occur if we continue to release fossil fuels today. Remember, this can be stopped at the rate we do today for at least a few hundred years.
So sea level changes around the world. Due to there being many different and changing climates around the world, sea levels vary among regions. So for example, if you were to go to the beach and look at the sea level, the water in the northern hemisphere or around like America, the country that we're in December would be at a lower sea level than, for example, in New Zealand. And this is because in New Zealand, their way that they're positioned on the earth, it's actually summer there and there's higher temperatures. And as we talked about a couple of slides ago, water expands in higher temperatures and shrinks in colder temperatures. And then, so in addition to this, when ice is lost due to melting, the water is relocated and it results in a lower sea level near where the ice melted. So for example, if you take a look at around the ice caps and up in the northern areas of the world, of the earth, where the ice is melting, the sea levels might be lower down there, but it's because the water is being dispersed and relocated down to around where the equator is. And so it's seen that regions in the tropics and around the equator, like countries around the equator, like El Salvador and Colombia, traditionally are going to have a 20% higher sea level because the water from the melting ice caps is being displaced to there. Tides, storm surges, and ocean waves all result in a short-lived kind of sea level variability, and they can cause flooding, coastal erosion, and shoreline destruction. So if you've ever been to the beach, you might see a sign that says like, look out for the tide, or like the tide is lower today. And that's because the tide varies on the time, the season, and it has a bunch of other different effects or factors that affect it, like such as like the moon. And the tide just is where the ocean is currently in relation to the shore. So if you've ever looked, when there's a low tide, the ocean is kind of further down the beach, and so there's a more shoreline and like less of, I would say, I guess, ocean. Versus when it's a high tide, there's less of like the beach and more of the water at the beach. And so if you've ever if you can see where the tide is based off of where the dry sand and the wet sand kind of meet each other, that just shows how far the waves are kind of reaching, which would be the tide. And when this affects coastal erosion, that just means like that there would be like barely any beach left. So for example, some beaches have a lot of sand and they're really big and they have a lot of area. And that's just because there's less coastal erosion that has happened to them over time, versus certain beaches where if you look, it's just it's just like a small little strip of like beach, and then the water. Those are areas that have had higher coastal erosion happen to those beaches.
So what are some effects of rising sea levels? In coastal areas, even small increases in sea levels can lead to destructive erosion, agricultural soil contamination, and lost habitats for birds, fishes, and plants. So this basically means that, like Joseph touched on, destructive erosion would mean that beaches are almost completely flooded, so it's impossible to reach them. So an example would be when I was little, I used to go to this beach in Michigan, and like there would be 200 people there on any given day. But I went back there a few years ago, and because of rising sea levels, the beach, there was barely any beach left. So like there's barely any people there anymore, and that's because all the water, or there's a lot of water that covered where the sand previously was, so it wasn't much of a beach anymore. And agricultural soil contamination just means that there's a possibility that the water gets contaminated when floods into a city or a small town or something, and it can get contaminated with possibly fertilizers or other toxic chemicals, and they could reach agricultural soil and possibly contaminate that soil. And even after the water is drained from the soil could still be contaminated, and it wouldn't be optimal for growing plants, or an optimal condition for growing plants. And then habitats can be lost just because the water could probably flood a bird's nest, or they could also make conditions where it's impossible for plants to be grown because plants they may be flooded, and they just probably couldn't grow under the new conditions or adapt to grow under the new conditions as they could previously. And then possibly with fish, so with water relocation, predators may relocate to areas with different fish in it, and that could disrupt the food web because the predators could possibly eat all the fish and decrease that fish population. And that could just cause some major problems in that tiny ecosystem, because maybe that fish preys on a species that is not as important and causes problems, and that could just lead to an entire disruption. So rising sea levels also contribute to more powerful storm surges, and these are the causes of half of the deaths from Atlantic hurricanes. So an example of this would be if a small town flooded, and the flood was powerful enough to move along things such as cars, which many floods are able to, and the cars could break into houses, like they could ruin or damage buildings, and this could cause even more flooding in houses. And if people aren't able to get to higher ground, they may drown, which could be terrible. And then rising sea levels also threatens basic services such as internet access, because much of the infrastructure lies in the path of rising seas. So if you guys have been to the beach before, you probably, or your parents probably, have been able to get service. They're probably on their phones or something, and that's because there are telephone towers near the beach. But if there was a flood and the flood was able to reach the telephone towers and impact the electrical circuit, it could possibly lead to power outages, and that could be a major problem if someone is in a storm and they need help, but they can't contact anyone because there's no internet access. So that could be terrible.
So how do rising sea levels affect island nations? Island nations are particularly vulnerable to rising sea levels because they're completely surrounded by water, meaning that if sea levels rise even a little bit, it can cause damage to homes, it can cause mass flooding, along with other issues. Additionally, as sea levels rise, their inhabitants are being forced to either raise the islands, which can cost a lot of money and may not be economically feasible for some of these smaller countries, or they have to relocate to another area, which also poses humanitarian issues for who is going to allow them to relocate to their country. Additionally, by 2100, sea levels are expected to rise between 1 and 4 feet, meaning that entire islands, specifically those that are smaller, could be wiped out. And if they are not wiped out, there could be severe economic problems due to the flooding and reduced plantation and irrigation systems. Especially with these plantation and irrigation systems, if they are wiped out due to flooding or contamination, that is these inhabitants' food source. So now they don't have a food source and making the island inhabitable.
How do rising sea levels affect our ecosystems? Islands which are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise are also important hotspots for biodiversity. 50% of threatened birds in the world live on islands. The loss of breeding sites due to rising levels threatens the existence of these species. The loss of habitat predicted due to rising sea levels is between 25 and 55%.
So with all this in mind about how the rising sea levels will affect coastal areas, island nations, and ecosystems, well, what can we do to restrict sea levels from rising and causing all of this destruction? Well, at first, as individuals, we could reduce our carbon footprint, as greenhouse gases are a large component in sea level rise. So some ways to reduce your carbon footprint are to, maybe drive less, or convincing like your parents to maybe instead of driving their car, you could, take a walk to the store or bike ride somewhere. Another way is to maybe, instead of using paper towels and toilet paper, there's tree-free options to change that. And they also make like tree-free paper towels and stuff. Because as we talked about, deforestation allows for more carbon dioxide to be in the atmosphere, which then creates more issues since there's less plants to act as biofilters and absorb the carbon dioxide, which segments into our second point, talking about how planting trees and plants helps to clean the air and absorb rain. So with the plants, they use CO2 and then turn that into oxygen. And so with less CO2, there's less greenhouse gases in the atmosphere because CO2 is a greenhouse gas, which then also allows for a cooler earth temperature overall, and then also produces oxygen, which we can use for us to breathe, as well as many other organisms on the earth. And then another way to restrict like the sea levels from rising is to like reduce our energy use within our homes by unplugging appliances and like turning off lights when not needed. So as Anna has mentioned in previous lesson, there's a thing called vampire energy. And in case if you were not there, we forgot, vampire energy is basically what happens when you leave like chargers or appliances plugged in when they're not in use. So it's still using the energy. It might not be using as much, but it's still using a significant amount. So what this does by unplugging our appliances and stuff is it helps reduce electricity usage, which kind of decreases the emissions from power plants, because since there's not as much need for the high amounts of energy companies instead will decide to, stop producing as much energy, in balance. And that just decreases them burning all these fossil fuels and coal and crude oil, which produces and pollutes a lot of CO2 as well as other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
So what is the importance of rising sea levels to sustainability? If sea levels continue to rise, the more destructive it will be more destructive on habitats, economies, in our communities. Rising sea levels disrupt the world balance and will lead to future consequences, such as mass floods, forcing people to migrate, but mostly decreasing cities' economic statuses, as we might have to abandon certain cities if they get flooded, wiping out entire species, as their habitats may be lost and it might not be sustainable for them to live in that habitat or anywhere else. Like they may require that specific habitat. And finally, destroying land for crops and irrigation. So like we previously talked about in our deforestation lesson, there's a major problem where we are losing land for growing crops. And that's why we don't think that it's sustainable to continue to use land or clear land for growing crops, just because eventually there's not going to be any left, and we're going to have to come up with a solution for how we're going to be growing our crops. And so with sea levels, if sea levels flood fields for land, then it's just a feedback loop, because we could have planted trees that could have absorbed CO2 from the atmosphere and restricted the sea levels from rising, but instead we just cleared land, so that was not a good idea. All right, this is the end of our lesson, so I'm going to stop